It's the holiday season, and Noble Knight's got a brand new code, and this time it's for 10% off. Hey everybody, your old buddy Hambone is here, and I am in the holiday spirit, and so are our friends over at Noble Knight Games. So much so that they've bumped the normal 5% discount code that they give us up to 10%, and this is just in time for the holiday season. So if you're thinking about buying some games or gaming accessories for your friends and family, look no further than nobleknight.com. Now, this coupon code is 10% off, and that is good for online or in-store purchases, and it's going to be running from the 25th of November all the way through December 22nd. That's 10% off all purchases online or in-store running from the 25th of November all the way to December 22nd. Now, the code is Vintage RPG, so you want to make sure that you put that in at checkout to get your 10% off. There is a minimum purchase requirement of $5, but once you get over that $5, it is 10% off across the board. December 22nd is the last day that you can get stuff for Christmas depending on shipping. So go on to nobleknight.com now and put in the code VintageRPG and get 10% off your purchases from November 25th to December 22nd. And happy holidays from your friends at Vintage RPG and our friends over at Noble Knight Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the editor-in-chief of Unwinnable.com. His name is not Simon, but he likes to do drawings of dungeons. Stu Horvath.
The thing that bums me out most about not running D&D at the moment is the fact that I don't get out that blue line graph paper and come up with some new dungeons.
It is one of your favorite things.
It really is. I do miss it.
Yeah.
We'll get back there.
I really hope to. So, Stu, what are we talking about today?
So in the mail this week, I got a package with a book that I had no idea was coming out, and it's from our friends at Andrews McMeel Universal, who published Zweihander. Zweihander. And it's called Dungeons and Drawings, an illustrated compendium of creatures by Blanca, Martinez de Rituerto, and Joe Sparrow. And it's just this fantastic, delightful book that is awesome. Before I get into the specifics of this book, I want to kind of talk about why this is cool. And just trust me on this, guys and gals. One of the things that has drawn me into Dungeons & Dragons and role-playing in general is monsters. Always loved monsters. Monsters are the coolest thing ever.
You know it.
And it's the monster manuals that drew me in, right? But I was interested in monster manuals because I was already interested in books about monsters. So like in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was sort of like this weird little boom industry of books, encyclopedic collections of like folklore monsters, right? So I love those books. I read them like they were my crack cocaine when I was a kid. I would get them out of the library, like Daniel Cohen's books. I profiled a couple of these on Vintage RPG. Like there's the Golden Book of the Mysterious World. There's the Enchanted World stuff from Time Life Books. There's all sorts of them. I have so many of these things on my shelves. Mike Mignola uses two specific books that the names don't immediately pop into my brain, but he's got two of them and I have them too. And basically the entire Hellboy line of comics has sprung out of these two reference books. This is just a thing that was a very specific thing from those decades that I mentioned. And they are so good. They are so cool. And like, they're such a great resource for anybody running a role-playing game, even though they're not role-playing books. And that's sort of what's going on here. This spins out of a blog project where they posted drawings of monsters with a little bit of folklore behind them. And that was it. And it got picked up into a book. Now, this is a little bit more role-playing game focused because there's like a light stat system that they come up with. And it's super broad and generic so that you can kind of use these monsters for any kind of game. There's a general alignment, good, neutral, evil. There's elemental things that they, kind of key into some of them. There's types of monsters, beast, construct, outsider, undead. All of this stuff is
The
like
basics.
Yeah, it's the basic stuff. And there's stats. You've got combat, magic, smarts, loot, and danger. And all of these things sort of give you an idea of how you would stat these monsters for the game of your choice.
Really?
Yeah, it's super broad in general, and like you can even ignore it. Or you could read it and it kind of gives you just a sense of the monster, sort of in the same way as the Young Adventurers guides do, you know?
Of course.
Yeah. And all of the monsters that they profile are all monsters either from folklore or from, the wider popular culture reinterpreted. So like you have stuff like fairies and the basilisk or the cockatrice or dragons, anything that's in, our real world folklore. But then you also have stuff like colossuses. And that's sort of drawn from like the Shadow of Colossus video games. They have some time travel creatures that are inspired very much from like time travel fiction, particularly Doctor Who. And like they kind of take these ideas the same way that they do with the folklore. They kind of make a thing out of it that you could use.
So it's not specifically, say, monsters that you would find in Dungeons and Dragons. It is more monsters you would have found in your travels if you were a monster hunter and you went to different realms and different galaxies and different worlds.
Exactly.
I love it.
And the art is so fun and so surprising. One of the things that I think that D&D has done to fantasy to its detriment is that it's sort of systematized what we expect monsters to look like. Like minotaurs look a certain way, dragons look a certain way. And it's something that's happened naturally over the course of decades because of art direction, because you want your products to look consistent.
100%. I mean, you know what a Dungeons and Dragons dragon looks like.
Yeah.
Because from the original Monster Manual till now, there's a very kind of unified style to it.
Yeah. And because Dungeons and Dragons is such a huge presence, their dragon has sort of become our dragon. It's like what we think of dragons as. It's the same sort of thing as the Lord of the Rings movies. Before the Lord of the Rings movies, there were a whole bunch of different visual interpretations. And I find that after the movies, I can't really see those characters as anybody but those actors. And a lot of the world is that Peter Jackson world to me.
Oh, 100%.
Which is the Alan Lee world. But you know what I mean? Like it became sort of fossilized in that moment.
Once you see it, it is imprinted upon your brain.
Exactly.
And that's, for better or worse, a lot of what media is nowadays.
Yeah.
We all know what the idea of a Batman looks like.
Yeah.
And it'll be nothing but Batman in our brains.
Yeah.
It's going to look a certain way. Like, what a Spider-Man looks a certain way. What a dragon looks a certain way. What a Wookiee looks a certain way.
Yeah. And there's variations, of course, depending on the artist. But the thing about these artists is that they are so relentlessly surprising. First of all, it's a colorful book. All the monsters are like all the colors of the rainbow. And I love that. I love the fact that it's like, this is fantasy. Why can't everything be like weird and colorful? Like D&D, especially later D&D, I feel like the 5th edition Monster Manual is very grays and blues all the way through, which is realistic, but it isn't exciting.
I was watching a nature show the other day, and all right, I'm lying. It was the Dora the Explorer movie that just recently come out. However, there was a poisonous tree frog that was bright orange. And I'm right there with you, because when you're saying that about the muted tones to me in Dungeons and Dragons, you're right. Just because something's trying to kill you doesn't mean it has to be dark.
Yeah.
Like, it could be bright and colorful and just as dangerous.
Yeah. And you could do surprising things. Like this picture of the mummy that I just opened up to. It doesn't have legs. It's just kind of coming genie-like out of a pot, which is like, whoa, that's awesome.
It's a fun concept.
It's holding this crazy scepter, which is, mummies hold scepters. I don't think that's particularly unusual. But then instead of like a mummified head, it's like got like this weird stone thing with multiple eyes on it. And it's just weird and surprising. Their minotaur has one eye. Why? It doesn't matter. It's just like you see this thing that you have a preconceived notion of, and then it breaks, it snaps it, and like you get to see something fresh that is so familiar and in a new way. And I think it's super exciting. I think that the art veers towards the cartoonish, which some people are kind of allergic to that. I don't care. I think that this is just such a fun, fact-filled, just meaty book. It looks like it's just like, it's like a book of pictures, but like there's so much going on. I think it's just a fantastic book.
I think the cartoonish thing is awesome, and yet I can see how it is a detriment in some ways, because when people think fantasy, they have a hard time wrapping their heads around something cartoonish looking, because there is a fine line when you make something cartoonish looking in fantasy between like How to Train Your Dragon and say The Dragon Prince on Netflix.
Yeah. There's a whole bunch of weird things. Like, look at this knoll.
That's a great looking knoll.
It's a great looking knoll. It's a minimalized knoll. Like you don't have all like the stuff that 5th edition knolls have. Like
Right.
they have all the trinkets and the piecemeal armor.
And for those listening at home, he's blue-ish purple.
Yeah.
You know, he's got war paint on. He's got a big old axe. He's got a loincloth.
But he's covered in blood.
Covered in blood. Oh, that's blood, not war paint. Oops.
And like he still looks mean. He still looks like he can eat you. He's purple, which is not a color I associate with gnolls, but I think it looks cool. It like gives like a different vibe than what I'm used to.
So do you think, because as I'm looking at that knoll, the knoll looks dangerous. However, it still looks cartoonish in a way. Do you think that people have a hard time wrapping their head around the cartoonish nature of some of the monsters, because then they would too have to imagine their character in a more cartoonish way?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think that because we live in a real world, we kind of automatically project ourselves into a real seeming world when we're in fiction. And I think that a lot of art has moved towards that over the years, because if you compare 1st edition D&D to 5th edition D&D, there's a greater focus on realism in 5th edition. Video games do the same thing. Like stylized art in video games is sort of niche, whereas everybody's pursuing, graphical power to make more realistic worlds. Well, I don't know. Do we need realistic worlds? You watched Primal.
I did. I loved it.
Is Primal not engaging and visceral and emotional because it's a cartoony product? Like that show gutted me.
Oh, I was definitely upset by that show.
I
in the best possible way.
I was a little upset that you guys recommended it to me because I had a really hard night that night.
Oh, buddy.
Oh, man, this is so sad.
Yeah, we're not going to spoil that for you. It is 5 episodes. They're about 20 minutes each. Go check it out. Gendy Tartakovsky's Primal.
Yeah.
So bringing it back to this book, you're right. Because it is cartoonish, it should not take me out of the immersiveness of fantasy.
Yeah.
So this book is pretty cool.
I think so.
It is freshly on the shelves.
It is.
Do you have any final thoughts on it?
I think that you should pick it up. I think that anybody who's running a fantasy game should pick it up. I think it will change your preconceived notions about the monsters that you're throwing at your heroes. I think there's just such a huge value in that because we all think these things. And you could describe the monsters to your players like they appear in this book, and they won't know what you're throwing at them. If it has one eye and it looks like a minotaur, but it has one eye, they're going to think it's something new. And they're going to freak, There's a practical value to this too.
I like it. I mean, I don't like it when you're doing it to me, but I like the idea of doing it to everyone else.
It's a 275-page book for $20, and it's fully illustrated. It's a really gorgeous book, and I think it's great, and you should pick it up.
You're going to look great on your shelf.
Yep.
So, Stu, where can the people find you?
They can find me every day at Vintage RPG on Instagram, posting stuff about books like this.
Very cool. You can find me on the Twitter at Handbreaker. I tweet about cute animals. I tweet about Dungeons & Dragons. I tweet about professional wrestling. You could also track my day-to-day operations in life and in podcasting on Instagram at John Hambone McGuire. You can also check out my other podcast, My Thai Happy Hour, wherever podcasts are found. And while you're on the internet, why not stop by our Patreon, patreon.com/vintagerpg. We've got extra content there, and we got some stuff we know you're going to love. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.